Welcome back to You Crew. My name is Alyssa Najera, and I am here with my co-host, Nikki Young, and this is the Therapists Uncut Podcast. Today, Nikki, what are we going to be talking about today?
We are actually wrapping back to our guest interview last episode, and we are talking about a little bit of a learning moment for Alyssa and I. Our whole premise here at TU is to make mental health relatable and a part of everyday conversation and just life experiences. And this is our opportunity to dissect something that we missed, something that we could have done much better in our last episode. And we're going to break it down, right? We're going to model. We always talk about self-awareness and reflection, right? So this is your episode where we get real and we reflect on what we absolutely could have done better. And that's where we learn from it. So join us. Let's get real.
Welcome to the Therapists Uncut Podcast, where off-the-clock therapists who happen to be friends share their uncensored thoughts about real life. Join us weekly in spreading positivity and making mental health relatable through casual conversation, inspirational stories, and real talk with friends who happen to be therapists. Please welcome your co-hosts, Nikki Young and Alyssa Najera.
So I just want to verbalize how I'm feeling right now because it just got reflected back to me that I am flush. If you're watching this on the camera, you might notice that apparently I match my orange pillow or the lipstick that I'm wearing, and I'm feeling a little hot because we're talking about something that's really vulnerable. You know, we have an entire episode on making mistakes that you guys will get in future seasons, and we just want to talk about learning from missed opportunities. And exactly like Nikki said, we re-listened to our episodes because we want to ensure we are showing up the best we can for you and giving you guys the best of what we have. And we realized there was a missed opportunity in episode 67 to really hone in on the fact that in no way, in no world is child physical abuse or really child abuse in general acceptable. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to make sure we wrap around to that today.
Yes. And I think it was just as a team, when we went back and listened to the episode, we just recognized that the way in which Alyssa and I responded really minimized and dismissed the concept. And for those who have not listened to the episode, I'm just going to give kind of a brief synopsis. We had an interview with a guest, and in that interview, she was talking about her process of finding a good fit as a therapist, which is something that we love to talk about, right? And she was sharing that one of these therapists that she had gone to see was not a good fit because when she presented for services, and it was in a session, she had shared about getting hit, and I think something along the lines of being beat like mom was an MMA fighter growing up. And the therapist's response was completely inappropriate. And she described that the therapist would get teary-eyed and cry for her and express such sympathy and, you know, that never should have happened to you, which, okay, let's all agree. Yes. Right. No kid deserves to get beat ever. However, you know, I think Alyssa and I chuckled at one point and we have, and again, our method of handling in that moment could have left definite misconceptions that we were condoning any form of child abuse. So there was two parts of that we want to eventually wrap back around on today and discuss. And one of those situations one of those scenarios was how the therapist responded to our guest, Gloria Magana, and what could have gone differently there. And then also child abuse.
It took a lot of vulnerability on our interviewee's part to come onto our show and share her story, just like all Absolutely. Of the guests that we have. That's a very humbling experience. And it's also very humbling for us to be able to self-reflect and practice the self-awareness that we are constantly talking to you guys about of, man, how could we have handled that differently? And now how do we go back, acknowledge that it was a missed opportunity on our end and make sure we get you the right information. And our team had a long conversation off camera on how that went and how Nikki and I could have handled that better. And so we do want to focus on those two pieces. I think we're going to roll right into the therapist response. And I want to give grace to this therapist too, because we're not perfect, right? As therapists, right. We have years
clearly
and years.
We fucked up last episode.
We have years and years of like training and experience, but we don't always get it right. And so being accountable for that, I think Nikki and I could agree that when you walk into a therapy appointment, your therapist is holding space for you to disclose all of the stuff that you've been carrying. Mm-hmm. And it's probably important for us as a therapist to not break down and cry in that moment. I'm even uncomfortable saying that like
right?
out loud.
It's not about you, right? It's not about the therapist. And I think and maybe really this is the primary focus of today, outside of us just acknowledging where we fell short, right? Because like Alyssa said, we want to practice what we preach. And we preach self-awareness because that's where it's at. And yeah, we could have listened to that episode, realized what happened, pulled the episode, pretended it didn't happen, something like that, right? But what good does that do? Like there's a learning experience here. And that is what we are all about. That's what we ask our guests to do, is come on here and talk about how they've learned from their life, right? We learned from our life. And I don't know, listen, I have never interviewed anybody, I don't think, outside of a work setting prior to being on this podcast. This is a very different dynamic. And man, we are learning as we go. And this was just one example of it. So first, I also want to apologize, right? If anybody listened to that and was hurt, offended, triggered, insert adjective here, like, I'm sorry.
And that triggered piece is so important because maybe you had no response to that. And maybe you have no idea what we're talking about. And you're like, I just listened to that episode and I'm a little confused. But for those of you who did have a response, we're just going to encourage you to be aware of what that was. And we do want to apologize if you felt triggered or re-traumatized in any way.
All right. So that is the main premise of our episode today. Really, is let's be self-aware, let's be humble, and let's learn, right? We don't want to keep making the same mistakes over again either. So let's learn from our experience. 2, like, let's just clear this up right now. And then we can move on to talking about how that therapist responded. But child abuse, not okay. All right. Any form. And I think that transitions into the talk about how that therapist responded to Glory when she came in to seek support. Right. Now, I know Alyssa said we don't know this person. That is absolutely true. We don't know what was going on. Right. However, I'm going to make some assumptions right now just to make my point. As a therapist, you never know who's walking into your office. You never know their cultural background, whether that be ethnicity, race, family dynamics, family of origin. You don't know. And most of the time, it's going to be a different background than you, unless you have a very specialized niche, right? I'm making the assumption here, and I'm going to make a point that this therapist, based on their life experiences up to that moment, was at a place where they were able to see and recognize that violence towards kids is not okay. Right. But not everybody that walks into your office, you're a therapist, right? I would hope that you would be at that point where that is your understanding. The violence is not okay. However, not everybody walking into your office is going to have those same life experiences that led you to that place. And so if somebody comes in and that's all they know, right? That's normal for them. What are you doing when you become emotional and tearful and telling them that you're so sorry that that's been their life and that they didn't? Do you think you're going to get anywhere? Right? Do you think you're...
And granted, we, as therapists, we want to be empathetic, and we are creating this space for you. And we, I guess, are speaking to the therapists and the people who are going to enter the therapy room as a client, that it's okay to have these vulnerable conversations if something did not sit right with you in the therapeutic relationship that you have. In fact, as therapists, we encourage that from our clients. If I ever did or said something that isn't sitting well, let's please talk about it, because that is the space to do that in. And also for Nikki, when Nikki mentioned, you said normalizing in some capacity. So we also want to ensure that we are not normalizing and contributing to this normalization of like, I beat the shit out of my kids, or my parents beat the shit out of me. And I would identify as the same culture as Gloria. And I would say that's pretty common verbiage. To be
the
like,
verbiage that she used to describe like
the
a
verbiage
spanking.
of like, okay. Absolutely, like, oh yeah, my parents beat the shit out of me, like, oh, they're chasing us with the chancla or whatever they got in their hand. But at the same time, when we start to normalize that kind of language, we don't recognize the difference between what is appropriate discipline and what is not. And we're not here to tell you what's appropriate and what's not. Everybody has their own form of parenting and discipline. But actually, I guess we are, because we are here to tell you that violence and physical abuse they're not okay. The law tells us that those are absolutely not okay. So we just want to make sure that we send that message loud and clear. We want to make sure, like, give grace to all of the people who are mandated reporters out there. It is not easy to decide when you are supposed to report. But if you look at the law tells us, if there's any suspicion of abuse, we are legally mandated to report that. So I would imagine that in this story, that therapists felt like, oh my gosh, I have information that this might need to turn into a report. So that assessment, I think, was accurate of deciding.
No, 100%, right? But in terms of the therapist's affect, like, is there any way in which she made that connection with Glory where Glory's going to come back? Have you done any good? Right? It's from the assessment aspect. Yeah, spot on. And I think that's another piece, right? We want to talk about assessment as therapists. That's another place where we need to take culture into account, right? Mm-hmm. You just talked about how that language is not uncommon and not something that was necessarily out of the norm for you. So that's where, if we're coming from a different culture and that sounds incredibly violent, let's do some assessment. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. When you say you got the shit beat out of you, what does that mean? Clear, is that something that you genuinely are ascribing? I mean, there's a lot of individuals who were physically abused and they would use that language to describe it. I got the shit beat out of me, and no, it wasn't okay. Right. But you just alluded to the fact that maybe somebody might use that and not even think about the meaning behind those words. Right. Let's not make assumptions, regardless of what those assumptions are. Like, I just made assumptions about that therapist. Let's not do that.
So I think I want to be very careful and very clear that in no way are we, I was going to say, in no way are we making assumptions, but Nikki just said she was making an assumption.
I made an assumption to make my point. So now I will clarify that I don't know what was going on in that therapist's life. Don't know where they were coming from.
We're not trying to throw shade anywhere. We're not trying to throw judgment anywhere. We just want to make it very clear that for Nikki and we had a missed opportunity to make it clear our stance from this podcast as co-host for you, that in no way do we condone physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. And Nikki was right. I was a former child welfare worker. So I have a lot of exposure to this world. And if you're in law enforcement, if you're in any kind of human services, that statement might have hit you a certain kind of way. And we just want to ensure that we are being accountable for our missed opportunity. Completely. And if at any point we contributed to any kind of re-traumatization, we apologize. There's part of me that wants to be like, we will be available after this episode if anybody wants to call, right? So please hear us in that apology.
Absolutely. Right. And this isn't coming from feedback we receive from others. This is our own self-reflection, because I can speak to that when I listen to it. Again, I was telling the team when we had our meeting before this that I tend to listen to our episodes on my way to work because the timing is pretty perfect. I can listen to an episode on the drive to work. Plug if you want to try that. I highly encourage it. But I got to that part of the interview, and she shared about her history of being beat up and laugh about it, shared the therapist's response, and the therapist's response was highly concerning. And we kind of laugh about, and then I'm driving and I'm just waiting for myself to circle back and clarify, like, okay, that was your experience, not a good therapy fit, yada, yada. But also let's talk about child abuse. And I just kept waiting. Right. And I'm like, oh crap, like we missed this. Right. And I felt icky. Like Nikki felt icky Nikki. It just brought about such discomfort for me. And I, Alyssa was a child welfare worker. I, for a long time, worked on a crisis mental health unit specific to minors. Their kids are crucial. And until I think it brought up specific faces that I could see too, right, of my clients, and just thinking how what has happened to them, I just completely unintentionally, but completely minimized. And I want to own it. And I want to acknowledge anything that we might have contributed to or caused in somebody, a response of any kind. And I also want to normalize this. I want to normalize saying we got something wrong and how do we learn from it? So this was our example, right? And I'm sure there's going to be plenty more to come. But we want to model how to address, what's the word I want to use, Alyssa? Like,
I'm still stuck to a missed opportunity and being accountable
Accountability.
or
Yeah.
doing something differently that you recognize maybe wasn't the best move or choice in that moment. I like to tell clients it's hard to have hard conversations, and it's hard to have hard conversations about something that happened 2 weeks ago. But sometimes they still need to be had, and starting a conversation off with something like, hey, I was thinking about our conversation 2 weeks ago, and I just wanted to talk to you about it. Like, that's literally what I feel like we are doing with you, is that we're thinking about the conversation that we had with you in our last release, and there was something that wasn't sitting right with us, and we want to take this opportunity to acknowledge it and be accountable for it and be vulnerable enough to be like, hey, that didn't go, maybe that wasn't the best way we could have gone about it, but please hear us, that we see it, and we are going to do our best to learn from it.
It's almost like we talked about a formula historically to help with some of these difficult conversations, right? But you can use a formula in these types of situations when you feel so uncomfortable. Like, how do I do this, right? I know I messed up. I hurt this person. I said something to my spouse I didn't need to, whatever it is. Like, where do we go from there? And I think you offered an awesome example of how to start the conversation, right? It's very casual, offhanded. Hey, I was thinking about, right? You're starting it off pleasant. Taking accountability is the next step, right? I was thinking about when I XYZ, right? When I slammed the door, storming out of the house because I was mad, when I forgot it was your birthday, insert offense here, all right? And then maybe how it might have impacted the person. I was seeing that it could have come across this way, or I was seeing that it did, and ask questions. Right? Because assumptions make an ass out of you and me. What did that raise anything in you? So I guess we're asking our listeners, and if you want to chime in on whatever platform, right, social media, if you want to chime in on any response you had, we're absolutely available to respond to that and hear you.
So I guess we're going to leave you with two more things today.
Yeah, we left you with a lot. I think we squirreled a little bit because we are also unintentionally demonstrating for you that these conversations can be uncomfortable, right? You don't have to do them perfectly. You just got to have them.
And we're doing the best that we can. And we're probably going to look back to this and be like, oh, why did we do that or say that? So the two things we're going to leave you with is, one, please reach out to us if the way we handled that conversation did not sit well with you. So do that in any way you feel comfortable, through the website at therapistuncut.com, through any of our social media. We do want to hear from you. And two, is there a missed opportunity in your life recently where you realize, man, I could have gone differently? And if so, what can you and what do you want to do about it?
That's what it's all about, Alyssa. And you summed that up perfect. So I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to leave it at that. So as always, we thank you for your time. We appreciate you hearing us out on this. And if you haven't yet, like, subscribe, share, join us, right? Because our whole mission is to make mental health relatable and a part of everyday conversation like these.
We'll see you on the next episode of Therapists Uncut.
Thank you for joining Therapists Uncut, a production of AMP Smart Business. To learn more about Therapists Uncut and stay up on upcoming episodes, please subscribe and follow us on social media. As a reminder, although the Therapists Uncut co-hosts are licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to substitute professional mental health counseling. If you need professional therapy, please contact your local provider or primary care provider. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Therapists Uncut.